Hello everyone, my name is Mario Tiazzo and I'm the Data Analysis and Visualization Librarian here at UMB Libraries. Today we're going to take a look at how to analyze the data in this spreadsheet by using various conditional calculations. Once again, we will be using a modified version of the PISA 2022 data for Hong Kong. For the purposes of this video, let's start by using the math scores data in column N. Here, Control-Shift down, Control-C to copy, Control-V to paste. So before we get started, what are conditional calculations? They are simply calculations that are based on the attainment or not of a single criterion or several criteria. The most basic example is an if function, which does something if a condition is met and does something else if that condition is not met. Today we're going to cover the if function, then move into other conditional calculation functions like AVERAGEIF, COUNTIF, and SUMIF, and finish off with a blended approach when we want to combine the condition with another function. Let's start with a basic but very powerful if function. This is your classic criterion-dependent formula. We do this by pressing the equal sign, the name of the formula, if, open the parenthesis. Notice that this formula requires three arguments: the logical test, the value if true, and the value if false. Note that the last two arguments are in square brackets, which means that they are optional. The criterion for the logical test can take on many different iterations. It can be equal to something, greater than something, smaller than something, or not equal to something. And that something could be another cell, a static number, or a string, or another formula or calculation. This time around, let's say that we want a condition that the math score be equal or greater than 600. So we'll highlight the cell for the math score, put the signs equal or greater than 600. That's our logical test. We'll put a comma to move on to the next argument. What do we want to return if this is true? We could return a string, a number, another formula. In this case, we want to return the word high. So we'll use quotation marks around the text to indicate a string. We'll press a comma to move on to the next argument. What do we want to return if the criterion is false? Let's put in the string low. Then we'll close off the parenthesis to finish off the formula, and we'll press enter. We can go back to the original formula with a cell, and we can double click on the little square at the bottom right corner of the cell to drag it all the way down. So the if formula lets us return something when a criterion is true or false. If we just wanted to return the words true or false, we could skip the if formula altogether and simply just write A2 is bigger or equal to 600. That will return true or false. We can drag this down, and the result is the same. Just press Ctrl-Z here to undo this. Just put if here. All right, let's move on to the ifs formula. This one is a bit different since it goes through a sequence and chooses the option where the first criterion in the sequence is true. Here I have the quartiles of the math score. You'll remember that we saw quartiles in an earlier video in this series. So what if I wanted to put my math scores into 4 buckets, but instead of quartiles, I wanted to use the tags next to the scores? Just a disclaimer that I created these tags and they are not necessarily representative of how PISA scores should be interpreted. They are just being used for explanatory purposes. Okay, to do this task, I could use the ifs function. We do this by, again, pressing the equal sign, the name of the formula, in this case ifs with an S at the end, open the parenthesis. Notice that this formula requires 2 arguments, the logical test and the value if true, and then the sequence loops back again and again. My first criterion will be that A2 here, the math score, is smaller than or equal to the value of the first quartile. So I'll just highlight it here, O2. Remember, that's the ceiling value of the lowest 25% of the scores. I press comma to move on to the next argument. If that value is true, then I'll return P2 or the major issues tag. Again, comma to move on to the next argument. I can continue with my next criterion. So this implies that the first criterion wasn't true. So what is next in the sequence? But A2 is smaller or equal to the value of the second quartile. Comma to move on to the next argument. If that condition is true, then I'll want it to return P3 or minor issues tag. I'm going to make sure that I put absolute cell references on my O and P column cells because I'll eventually drag this down and I want to ensure that my formula references this table. So I'm just going to put F4 here, F4 here, F4 here, and F4 here. And to speed things up, I'm going to copy and paste this formula and change the cell references to finish off the reference table. I'm going to put a comma here, Control V, and instead of O2, put O4 here, P4, O5, and P5. Now my entire table is covered. I will close the parenthesis and press Enter. Let's double click on the little square at the bottom right corner of the cell to drag it all the way down. Make this a little bit bigger. Great. The IFS formula is a more elegant way to do multi-criteria IFS that used to be done by using a series of nested if formulas. Let's move on to the COUNTIF function. You'll recall that we have already used this when we were creating frequency tables. So this function will count the number of cells that satisfy a certain criterion. We do this by pressing the equal sign, the name of the formula, COUNTIF, open the parenthesis. Notice that this formula requires two arguments, the range and the criteria. So let's highlight the data for the range requirements. So this will be our math scores. I'll click on the first one, Control Shift down to include the entire series. I'll press the comma to move on to the next argument. Again, the condition could be any of the elements we discussed in the if function. In this case, let's say we wanted this criterion to be math scores above 700. If we put 700 in the formula, it will return the count of any score that is exactly 700. So let's close the parenthesis here, press Enter. This returns 0. So there are 0 times in this data set where the math score is exactly 700. If we want it to be greater than 700, we need to add a little bit of code. Let's go back in the formula here. We need to put the greater than symbol, but that is a string, so we need to put quotation marks around it. So let's put quotation marks around that, and then we need to use the ampersand to connect it to the number, like so, and press Enter. There we go. It's not super intuitive, but once you do it a few times, you get the hang of it. So put COUNTIF here. Now, I don't really like to bury my condition in the formula because it's not explicit. If I wanted to see it, I'd have to click on a cell. So let's make it explicit, and instead of hard coding it in a cell, let's link it to a cell. So let's put criterion here. Let's put our 700 here, and instead of hard coding it in our formula, let's link it to this cell. The result is the same, but it's much more explicit. And if I change this number here, my formula changes automatically. Okay, so that was COUNTIF. Let's take a look at COUNTIFS. That's basically the same mechanism, but this time we can add more than one condition. Let's set out our criteria right away and use a COUNTIFS to calculate the results. We do this by pressing the equal sign, the name of the formula, COUNTIFS, open the parenthesis. Notice that this formula requires two arguments, the criteria range 1 and the criteria 1, and then it loops back again and again. Let's highlight the data for the range requirement. Again, this would be the math score. Control Shift down, comma, to move on to the next argument. Here we want the criterion to be math scores above or equal to 300. So we would write quotation mark, greater than or equal, quotation mark, ampersand. Then we could write 300, or we could link it directly to the cell. I5 in this case. Comma to move on to the next argument. Since we will be using the math scores again for the second criterion, let's highlight the math score range again for the criteria range 2 requirement. Let's go up here, click at the top of the data series, Control Shift down, get the entire data series, comma to move to the next argument. Here we want the second criterion to be math scores below or equal to 700. So we would write quotation mark, smaller than or equal to, quotation mark, ampersand to tie in this text with the next element. We could write 700 here, but let's instead link it to a cell to make it more explicit and more dynamic. So in this case, J5. We close the parenthesis to end our formula, and then we press Enter. 5,491. So we have 5,491 students in this data series that have a math score between 300 and 700 inclusively. Okay, we put it COUNTIFS. Let's move on to AVERAGEIF. This is the same concept as COUNTIF, but the formula returns the average, aka the mean, instead of a count. The mechanics are also slightly different. Before we start, let's include another data series from the PISA dataset for this example. This time, let's choose the gender series in column T. Let's go back here. Let's pick the gender series. Let's put it here. First, we notice that the data is a binary, 1 for female and 2 for male, which is not necessarily the way all members of the population identify. With that caveat in mind, I'm going to quickly transform this numeric series into a string because I want to show you that these formula can also handle text. So I'm going to use the switch function, which we haven't come across yet. So I'm going to go over here, press equal, the name of the formula, switch. Notice that this formula requires 3 arguments: the expression, value 1, result 1, and then it loops those 2 final arguments again and again. I'll highlight D2 for my expression. This is kind of the lookup cell. Press comma to tell Excel that we are moving on to the next argument. I'll put in a 1, so it's telling to look for a 1, comma to move on to the next argument, and then I'm going to type in female with quotation marks. This is text. Close quotation marks. So when it comes across a 1, it'll switch it to the text female. Comma again to move to the next argument. This time 2, comma, and we'll put in male in quotation marks. So when it comes across a 2, it'll switch it to male. Close the parenthesis, press enter. Then we go to the bottom right corner, drag it down, and all our 2s have turned into males, and all our 1s have turned into females. We'll tag this again, gender text. Okay, let's set out our criterion for the average if, and let's calculate the average scores for females. So press equal, then the name of the function, average if, open the parenthesis. Notice that this formula requires 3 arguments: the range, the criteria, and the average range. So let's highlight the data for the range requirement. In this case, the gender text. Control Shift down, comma to move on to the next argument. The criterion should be female, which will link directly in the cell. We could write in a text female in quotation marks, but let's link it to this cell, comma to move on to the next argument. So it's looking for female in the E column. What do we want it to average? If it does find female, we want it to return the average of the column A results, the math scores. So let's select that range, close a parenthesis, and press enter. So the average math score for females is 540.7 in this data set. We could do the same for male by creating absolute values for our ranges and then just bringing it down. So here we can just press F4 on our ranges, bring this down, put in our criterion, in this case male. So the mean math score is slightly higher for males than females in this sample. Also note that we could use a criterion to exclude something. So if I wanted to exclude female, for example, and since there are only 2 elements to this variable, it should return the same value as male. So let's move this over here and link it back to female. We have the same result in column J as K. Now let's say instead of female, we wanted to say not female. We would put it in quotation mark. We would put smaller than, greater than, quotation mark, ampersand. The smaller than, greater than tells Excel not. So basically it's an exclusion, exclude female. So when we press enter on this, since we're excluding all females, we should get the same result as the males, which we do, right? 549.8 in both cases. Obviously, this would be more helpful if we had more than 2 categories, but hopefully you can see how it could be a helpful way to eliminate an element from your data. All right, let's move on to average ifs. But before we start, let's include another data series for the PISA dataset in this example. This time, let's choose the immigration data series in column W. Go back here, at the top here, column W, Control Shift down, Control C, Control V. Great. Average ifs is basically the same mechanism as COUNTIFS, but with a few tweaks. Let's set out our criteria right away and use average ifs to calculate the results. So here, our first criterion is female, our second criterion is 1, which will be our immigration status, and our third criterion, you'll notice, is the top end of the third quartile. Here we want to see how many instances females that have an immigration status of 1, so native students, and have a score above the third quartile. This is the top end of the third quartile, so anything in the fourth quartile effectively. So we're looking for the average score of female native students in the fourth quartile. We do this by pressing the equal sign, the name of the formula, average ifs, open the parenthesis. Notice that this formula requires 3 arguments: the average range, the criteria range 1, and the criteria 1. And then the last 2 arguments loop back again and again. So let's highlight the data for the range requirements. In this case, the math scores, comma to move to the next argument. Let's highlight the data for the criteria range 1 requirement. So in this case, it's the gender text range. Control Shift down, comma to move to the next argument. Here we want the criterion to be female, so we'll link it to the cell, I13, comma. Criteria range 2 should be in the F column, the immigration status. Control Shift down, and the criteria should be 1, native students. So we link to that cell, press the comma again. Our criteria range 3 should again be the math scores. And the criteria 3, we'll put a comma here to move to that. Here we want the criterion to be above or equal to the 618. So we would write quotation mark greater than or equal to quotation mark ampersand and then the cell reference 618.832, close a parenthesis, press enter. 668.703. We could do the same for the males by creating absolute values for our ranges and then just bringing that down. So let's do that. Our ranges should all be converted to absolute cell references by pressing the F4 key. Let's bring this down. And let's fill in the criteria. Here we want it to be male. We also want it to be 1 here, native, and we want the same criterion here as well. So the male native students who are in the 4th quarter have a slightly better mean math score compared to their female counterparts in this sample. All right, there's also the SUMIF and the SUMIFS functions, and they act and are constructed in the same way as the AVERAGEIF and AVERAGEIFS function, except that instead of returning the mean of the met conditions, they return the summed values. In this data set, it doesn't make a lot of sense to sum the data, so I won't create an example here other than to change the AVERAGEIF functions to show you that the concept is the same. So if we moved here and just instead of AVERAGEIFS, we put SUMIFS, it would calculate the sum. It's constructed exactly the same way. Press Control Z here to undo it. Same thing here, AVERAGEIF, I could put SUMIF here, and it would add up all the values. Again, these data points don't have a ton of value except to show you that you can do conditional sums and they are constructed exactly the same way as their average counterparts. Control Z here to undo it. Okay, what if we wanted to create a conditional calculation for something that doesn't have a built-in formula like AVERAGEIF? What if you wanted to calculate a conditional standard deviation, for example? Let's recall that the standard deviation of a sample formula is STDEV.S, and then you put in your range within the parentheses. Okay, with that in mind, what if we could create a condition within that formula, within that range? That's where our humble if function comes back into play. Earlier, we used it to return a single point. Every cell had its own if formula. We can also use the if function to spill out an array. So to do this, we press equals, name of the function, if, open the parenthesis. In this case, instead of putting the logical test as a single cell, we would highlight a range. So let's highlight the gender text range. And what do we want it to be equal to? Equal to, quotation mark, female. So if this range is equal to female, we'll put a comma here to move to value if true. What do we want it to return? We want it to return the math score equivalent. So look for any female in the E column, and when you do find it, return the math score. So we'll highlight the math score range. We don't have to put in a value if false. Remember, that's an optional argument. We'll close the parenthesis and press enter. And here we have a spilled array where the math scores only show up if the criterion is satisfied. In this case, if the gender is female, right? False, 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 and then it finds female, okay, and it returns those scores. And it'll continue to do that across the data set. We can then use the standard deviation formula to get the standard deviation of the female participants. But this is a bit sloppy, so let's try to clean it up a little bit with our explicit criterion. Let's recycle our spilled array if formula, and let's put the standard deviation formula as a wrapper around it. So let's take this if formula, copy it, put it here, put equals, let's put our standard deviation around it. So right now our standard deviation is wrapping around our if formula. We press enter and we get the exact same result. So we can delete this and delete this. We could do the same for the male values by creating absolute values for our ranges and then just bringing it down. So let's go back here. Let's F4 these ranges. And actually, this is hard-coded. This should really be the cell right here so that it's dynamic and explicit. So let's drag this down. Let's put male here. And there we have it. So the male students have a slightly more variable math score when using the standard deviation compared to their female counterparts in this sample. Okay, that should be good for now. We've learned different ways to create conditional calculations from the if and ifs functions to COUNTIF, AVERAGEIF, SUMIF for single criterion, to COUNTIFS, AVERAGEIFS, SUMIFS for multiple criteria. Finally, we also learned how to use the if function to create a spilled array when we want to calculate something that doesn't have a ready-made conditional formula. I hope that this was helpful. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.